Chapter 1. When I was a little girl, my mom loved to tell me the story of my birth. She would wrap me up in my favorite blanket, and sitting next to the fireplace, she would hold me close as she spoke. One night, years ago, I started to have a baby, she began, and every time I giggled and squirmed as I knew she was talking about me. Yes, that's right, my love. This baby's name was Autumn, and would be the pride and joy of my life. But things didn't go so well at first. You see, your daddy was in the neighboring village that night, and I was all alone. So for the first few hours, I yelled and screamed and tried to wait, but you didn't want to wait any longer. So even though I was in a world of pain, I walked to the Nallis farm just across the way, and they helped me deliver you. Everything was going well, and your daddy even managed to make it back in time. But I was so scared when I saw you, because the first time I held your small body in my hands, you were so frail. In that moment, I was afraid for your life. Oh, but then a miracle happened. You opened your eyes, and in them I saw a fire so bright and strong and flickering with the colors of autumn that I knew, no matter how the world scorned you, that your fire would always burn bright. I loved to hear the story, but as I grew older, I would look at my reflection in the glassy waters of the lake, and not once did I see anything remarkable. But Mum continued to tell the story, so I kept looking. Thankfully, I eventually grew past the age of bedtime stories, and was no longer forced to confront what I had then decided were only lies. Yet still, I often found myself looking for that fire, only to find the familiar sting of disappointment as I stared at my painfully normal brown eyes. My favorite reading spot had always been the hill in the center of our farming village, where a large weeping willow tree sat. It was a cherished piece of our village's history, as, with the help of some ages-old magic, it never molted, nor wilted, nor felt the force of the seasons. I spent my days under that tree, a book from my parents' shop always in my hands. My parents ran the only non-farm goods shop in the village, which meant that we got supplies from all across Athos. My parents sold everything from magical charms to clothes to, of course, books, meaning I had a never-ending stream of books and an unhealthy obsession with reading any book before my parents could sell it. Today, I had just gotten a new book from the shop's inventory and hadn't waited a moment longer than necessary to take my spot atop the hill. I had even forgotten to change out of the dress I had worn for chores that morning. Not that it mattered much to me, as my day was spent in total solitude, lost among the book's pages. But many peaceful hours of reading later, as the gentle heat of the evening sun caressed my face, a voice called out to me, breaking my trance. "Autumn! Autumn, come on! We'll be late for our picnic with the Ormeal boys," Tolly called out, panting as she ran up the hill towards me. As she came close, I glanced up from my book, peeved to be interrupted with only a few chapters left till the end of the book. Raising an eyebrow, I asked in an unamused tone, "Who?" She pouted and snatched the book from my hands. "Hey," I began to protest, but she cut me off. "Oh, you know who I'm talking about. The twins from the neighboring village." I knew who she meant, but for the sake of my stolen book and a bit of entertainment, I stared up at her quizzically. She huffed, waving my book around dramatically as she tried to explain. "The wood elves? The ones that invited us out last week?" I shrugged and raised my hands, showing my apparent cluelessness. She sighed sourly and plopped down on the ground next to me. Tolly then started the story dejectedly, explaining the previous week and how the Ormeal twins had invited us for a double date in the meadow. I struggled to hold back a laugh as she continued, but she saw my face out of the corner of her eye. "You're playing me for a fool again, aren't you?" she said, narrowing her eyes at me. I giggled, finally giving in. All right, I remember." I stood up, carefully offering her his hand as well. She stuck her tongue out at me and took my hand. "So you'll go like you promised, won't you?" she asked, wiping the grass from her dress. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer, and let my eyes drift off to the side as I considered it. Tolly sighed heavily and finally handed back my book. "Look, I know you're still recovering from Gonray, but really, it's time for you to find someone new," she said, likely not intending for her words to sound as spiteful as they did. I winced at her tone and the mention of Gonray's name, mildly upset she had reminded me of such painful memories. But at the same time, I knew she was right and nodded reluctantly. Seeing the droop in my smile, though, she added lightly, "You know, I have a feeling your future boyfriend may have a twin brother." I gave a small but brighter smile after rolling my eyes. "Great, let's go then," she squealed girlishly and began dragging me down the hill, failing to take into account that I was hardly prepared for the outing. "Tolly," I called out as I dug the heels of my boots into the ground, bringing her to a sharp stop. She spun around, confused at first, but after I dramatically gestured to my ragged clothes, she finally caught on. "Oh, well, you can't go out like that." I opened my mouth to give a sarcastic quip, but she had already begun dragging me off to her house. As we ran past the many farm fields, I watched as the sun slowly began to move across the sky, lighting the edges of it with a soft pink. Lost in the beauty of the sunset, I had hardly noticed arriving at Tolly's house. Her house, though on the small side, was lovely. Always the outer walls were overgrown with an ivy that her mother proudly cared for and sold cuts of. The house itself was a typical wooden farmhouse with a thatched roof, but their fields reached right up to the edge of the fence. At harvest time, it was surrounded by a golden sea of wheat. This alone made the house beautiful, but what added to it even more was the energy of its inhabitants. Tolly and her parents were so bright that I doubted anywhere they lived could remain dull for very long. Tolly's room reflected this energy most of all, as she had fit every flower, accessory, and beautiful dress possible into the small nook that was her room. Even Tolly's outfit that day sparkled with a light that matched her own beauty. The poofy green dress perfectly accompanied her vibrantly green eyes, and the gold chain earrings on her pointed ears matched the pleasant glint of her smile. I caught myself staring at her for a moment, but she soon snapped me out of it as she haphazardly threw a dress at me. "Try that on," she called as she continued to dig through her drawers. I stumbled over my feet as I hurriedly tried to change into the dress, but I soon recovered. I held my breath as I slid on the borrowed dress. It became obvious, though, that even when tied loosely, the dress was too small. I sighed heavily in disappointment, biting my lips softly. Though I hated myself for it, I had always held a bit of resentment towards Tolly, and the ill-fitting dress was a stark reminder of it. I was chubby, to say the least, with horribly pale skin, while she was made of soft curves and lightly blushed skin. My hair, which barely brushed past my shoulders, was a ragged mess, while hers flowed down past her hips in soft, glowing red coils. She was the picture of beauty, and as I slipped out of the dress, my mind slipped into still darker thoughts. In all likelihood, the twins had invited her out, not me, using the double date as an excuse to spend time with Tolly. But sweet, sweet Tolly usually paid no mind to things like that. She often smiled sweetly, ignoring my numerous flaws, as she innocently believed that I was capable of being liked by someone other than her. I loved her like a sister, and she loved me. Though no one is perfect, and even gentle Tolly sometimes betrayed my trust by occasionally shunning me in order to fit in. But of course I loved her, and I knew that once she had achieved her goal of popularity and saw its emptiness, she would apologize, and everything would be back to normal. This was how it always had been, and it did not bother me in the least, or so I told myself. But for now things were normal, and Tolly was handing me another dress. "I was going to wait until your birthday to give you this, but I suppose it is only a few days early." "I made this for you," she said, her smile lighting up her face as she held out the dress towards me. I stared, bewildered for a few moments, as I processed what she had said. She had made this? It was of such high-quality material and craftsmanship that I was taken aback. She placed the dress carefully in my hands, and I immediately tried to push it back towards her. I can't take this. It's much too beautiful for me, Tolly. Keep it for yourself," I said, flustered, as I tried to make her take it back. But she stepped back quickly, leaving the dress in my hands. "Now, Autumn, this is your birthday present. You wouldn't turn down a heartfelt present from your best friend, now would you?" she teased, pouting dramatically, but it was obvious that she wouldn't take no for an answer. My cheeks reddened in embarrassment as I began to put on the dress. The shockingly soft fabric furled and danced in waves as I slipped it on. Tolly waved her hands excitedly, motioning me to turn around so she could reach the ties in the back. Even though the dress had slid on easily, I still held my breath out of habit. As Tolly finished tying it, though, I found that a smile had crept onto my lips as I looked down at the dress. "It's perfect," I whispered, surprised she had gotten the measurements right. At my words, she moved in front of me and beamed happily before giving me a gentle hug, careful not to wrinkle the dress. After a moment, I leaned back and looked at the dress a bit more. It was beautiful, a lovely dark blue shade with a small white flower pattern at the hems. It was long and flowed nicely, not clinging to me nor sticking out too much, and I couldn't help but grab her into a tight hug. "Thank you, Tolly. Though I don't know if I deserve it, thank you." She mumbled something at first in a distressed tone, likely to protest that I would wrinkle the dress, but after a second she hugged me tightly anyway. Finally, she stepped back and motioned me over to a small wooden stool where she brushed my hair, taming the brown mess, if only just for a bit. Then, just as quickly as we had come in, she was rushing me out the door, only stopping long enough to wave to her parents in the fields. By now, the sunset had begun to cover the fields in a soft orange hue, and once more I focused on the sky's beauty, trying to ignore that I was about to be shoved into an outing that was for Tolly to be doted on. But despite my meager attempt to try to avoid the situation, we eventually arrived on the outskirts of our small farming town where a large meadow sprawled for miles until it reached the base of a nearby mountain range. The sun had already slipped behind the mountains, and the fireflies and fire fairies were emerging from the grass as we walked up to the two shadowy figures sitting on a blanket. Lounging in the warm glow of the dimly lit lamp they had brought, the figures laughed giddily, failing to notice us. I would have been perfectly content to keep it that way, but Tolly quickly called out to them. "Hi, boys. Did we keep you waiting long?" she chimed cheerily. The two turned to face her, and though their faces were in shadow, it was clear that they wore wide smiles. Tolly led me over to the other side of them, so we could sit in the light of the lamp. As soon as we sat, the twins scooted visibly closer to Tolly, immediately beginning to fawn over her. At first, I instinctively scrunched up my face, a small pain stinging at the back of my mind. However, I soon relaxed as I came to the realization that I could simply read instead of enduring the awkward evening. I did my best to read in the low light while Tolly and the Ormeal boys, Gerald and Janal, chatted and laughed. The two of them were remarkably similar in their appearance, clothes, and even hair, which was pulled back into the same short ponytails. Their only identifying factor was their voices. Whereas Gerald's was deep, Janal's had a higher pitch and cracked a bit when he spoke. I occasionally glanced up to watch their mannerisms, each copying the other without realizing it. But despite my occasional glances, I passed the time with my nose buried in my book. The evening carried on like this for a while, until a lull made its way into their conversation, and a snide whisper found its way to my ears. "Such a lovely dress for such an ugly face, don't you think, brother?" Gerald snickered, running his hand cockily through the strands of his blonde hair that hung loose. "Ah, yes, a shame for it to go to waste," Janal whispered, and then, as he pushed himself upward to sit on his knees, he cleared his throat and spoke in a louder voice to Tolly. "That dress she is wearing is so lovely, but it suits your beauty so much better, Tolly. Why didn't you wear it?" Tolly looked a bit panicked at first as she glanced from me to the twins. I glanced up from my book now and saw the indecision circling in her eyes. Perhaps in the past I would have silently begged for her to defend me, but now I already knew who she would choose, so I looked back down to my book. As I expected, she finally relented and in an embarrassed voice, betraying me once more, said, "Oh yes, she's just borrowing it for tonight. Poor thing didn't have anything else to wear." The twins grinned devilishly as they looked over to see my reaction. I did not give them the satisfaction, though, and continued reading my book. Janal snarled and moved closer to me. "Hey, are you deaf, boar-face?" I ignored him once more, this time more out of fear than stubbornness. Clearly, this only riled him up more, though, and Janal began to stand, reaching a large hand toward my face. Just as I squeezed my eyes shut and flinched away from him, a voice called out, "Well, if it isn't the Ormeal boys, what are you two doing here with these lovely ladies? They're a bit out of your league, don't you think?" The voice, deep and light-hearted, called out into the night, originating from a tall figure in the shadows. Janal spun around to face him, ready to fight as he clenched his fists tight. But once the figure waltzed into the light, Janal flinched backwards, his anger quickly fading into fear. "Creel, what are you doing here?" he growled, trying to be intimidating but failing. The young man stood an intimidating 6 feet, with an extremely toned, though not bulging build, and sleek brown hair pulled back into a long braid that dangled over one of his shoulders. His stature and build alone was threatening, yet his smile was by far his most frightening feature. His face, though lovely, was stiff, and his smile held a determined and menacing air to it. I slowly lowered my head and lifted my book to cover my face, hoping to stay out of the fray. Creel spoke clearly, a sharp edge in his tone. "I had thought you two were supposed to be helping Asar tonight, yet lo and behold, on my evening walk, I find you two insulting these lovely women with your vile presence." I peeked over the top edge of my book just in time to see Gerald stand to face him, though he remained slightly behind his brother. "What business is it of yours, Creel?" Gerald hissed at him, though he too was obviously scared and his hands shook. Then, cracking his neck, Creel lowered his voice into a rumbling whisper. "Go home, boys." The twins flinched backwards and, grabbing their bags, immediately took off running. As they ran off, I covered my face with my book once more. I feared that the man would give me the same harsh treatment, and in my fear I held my book so close to my face that it hugged my nose. But to my surprise, Creel chuckled lightly, slinging his own bag down next to me. Sitting with a loud thump, he spoke gently. I'm sorry they were so rude to you two. I was quiet for several moments, wondering why Tolly hadn't responded, and slowly lowered my book. To my surprise and horror, I realized that Tolly had run off with the twins, likely equally as scared as them. Seeing this, I quickly ducked back behind my book, hoping that if I ignored him for long enough, he would give up and go away. My brilliant social tactic failed, though. As soon a heavy hand pushed down on the top of my book, revealing my eyes. Creel stared at me curiously, his head tilted and an eyebrow cocked up at me in confusion. Books don't double as invisibility shields, you know, he joked. Heat rushed to my cheeks, and vaulting to my feet, I closed the book and shoved it into my bag. Right, well, goodbye, I stuttered awkwardly as I gave him a half bow and clumsily began to run off in the other direction. I didn't make it far before Creel easily outran me and stopped me dead in my path. I stumbled a bit in surprise, sending my bag shooting forward off my shoulder and onto his feet. I froze, eyes wide, and stared at the bag blankly, wondering whether or not I should grab it and run. But before I could come to a decision, Creel bent over and picked up the bag, an odd mix of deviousness and confusion playing out on his face. As he lifted the bag, I reached out a shaky hand, expecting him to return it. However, he grinned wide and started to dig through my bag. Hey, just what do you think you're doing? I said, intending to sound intimidating, but my voice only managed to slip out as a whisper. Creel paid me no mind and continued digging through my bag until suddenly he threw it back, making a small puff noise as it hit my face. I flinched away, but to my surprise, I managed to regain my balance and grab the bag from my face. As I fumbled to put the bag back on my shoulder, I saw that Creel was examining my book. No wonder it didn't hurt when the bag hit me, I thought to myself. As he was reading a random page, I winced and forced myself to reach out and grab the book. Creel's eyes met mine as I did this, and I realized that he easily could have dodged out of the way, but surprisingly, he let me snatch the book back from his hands. Holding the book tightly to my chest, I attempted a menacing glare, which was likely more sour than scary. Unsurprisingly, Creel burst out in laughter. My face flushed a deep shade of red. Unwilling to say or do anything more that involved this man, I marched past him. But as I was stomping away furiously, my boot caught the edge of my dress, and in a flash the sky became the ground as I slammed into it. Wincing in pain, I struggled to stand. My dress was still caught on my foot. I slipped and fumbled for a few moments, trying to remain composed, when a pair of strong hands placed themselves under my arms and effortlessly pulled me up. I felt as though I were a little girl again, with my father lifting me up to comfort me when I had fallen. But I was lost in this daydream feeling for only a few seconds before I snapped back to reality. And once my feet were securely back on the ground, I covered my face with my hands, unwilling to turn to face him. I stayed like this for a moment until Creel walked around me and tapped me lightly on the hands. I reluctantly lowered my hands, my cheeks burning with embarrassment, as I expected him to tease me again. But as I looked up at him, I saw an apologetic, sincere smile. My reluctance faded and was instantly replaced by nervousness. Thank you, I managed to mumble meekly as I fidgeted with the strap of my bag and tried to avoid looking him in the eye. Creel, still wearing a smile of apology, scratched the back of his head with one hand. No, I'm sorry. It's my fault you fell in the first place, so you don't need to thank me. I kept quiet for a moment, adrenaline making my mind reel. At first, I opened my mouth to say something like, "It's okay," or "No worries," but a tightness pulled at my throat, refusing to let any words escape. Seeing me struggle, Creel reached out a hand. "Can I walk you home to make it up to you?" My mind spun, thinking of all the ways this could possibly end badly, but he had chased off the twins and helped me when I fell. Reluctantly, I nodded and started walking slowly, not taking his hand. Just because he was walking me home didn't mean I was going to let him hold my hand. I was far too nervous as it was. I'm Autumn, by the way," I managed to mumble nervously. "Creel," he said simply, smiling. We walked together in silence, slowly making our way through the field until we reached the road. I kept my eyes trained on the ground as my thoughts fought over whether this had been a good idea. Since he was walking me home, he'll know where I live, which could mean awkward social encounters. Or maybe that wasn't a bad thing? Do I want to see him again after this? I wasn't sure, and the quiet crunching of dirt beneath our boots didn't reveal any answers. After a few moments of silence, Creel cleared his throat as though he was finally going to say something, but as I looked up at him, he blushed and chuckled awkwardly. I dropped my eyes back to the ground and resigned to the fact that the entire walk would be done in silence. A pit opened up in my stomach as the thought occurred to me that maybe I should say something. But what should I say? Surely anything I could come up with would just be bothersome. Or maybe it's rude to not say anything at all. My heart raced and my brain flooded with panic. So how do you know the Ormeal twins? I found myself saying without thinking. Where the words had come from, I had no clue, but now a new panic set in as I wondered how he would respond, and if I had overstepped by asking. I glanced up at him as he smiled widely, looking at the road ahead as he laughed. Those idiots live in my village. I've known them my whole life, and they never fail to get themselves into some kind of trouble by harassing people. I gave a small laugh. Yeah, that sounds about right. How do you know them? He asked, turning to look at me. I felt a heat rising to my face again, and looked back at the ground. Tolly introduced them to me last week, and they asked us on a date for tonight. Tolly? Is that the girl that ran away when they did? He laughed. Yeah, that would be her. I sighed. Sorry to scare her off like that. I only intended to get rid of the twins. He apologized. Then, clearing his throat, Creel's voice lowered, and in a concerned tone he said, I hope you don't mind, but I did overhear the conversation before I interrupted. Why didn't your friend stand up for you? My heart panged with pain as a tightness settled in my chest. How was I supposed to respond? How should I explain that my best friend casually betrays me from time to time? I swallowed hard and just said the first thing that came to mind. Yeah, that's just how she is sometimes. It's not a big deal. Creel stayed quiet for a few moments, perhaps out of shock, or maybe just to think. Why do you stay friends with her? He said slowly, genuine confusion and a little disgust laced in his voice. My anger flaring, I glared at him. Excuse me? Who do you think you are? I spat the words at him with venom. He recoiled a bit, confusion and pain written on his face. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to overstep. His voice trailed off, and it was clear that he was hurt. I stopped walking and reached out a hand, placing it gently on his arm. Creel stopped and looked at me through scrunched eyebrows. No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you, or say it like that. I'm sorry. You didn't overstep. I'm just kind of protective of her, I said, doing my best to explain. It's okay. I understand, he sighed, dropping his eyes to the ground. Or, well, I guess I don't understand. You're protective of her, but she won't stand up for you to those twats? How is that fair, or even okay? Creel looked me in the eyes, waiting for my response, but I didn't know what to say. His questions hurt, and I didn't like thinking about things like that. Ignorance is bliss, as they say. But saying that out loud would sound sad. Eventually, I dropped my hand from his arm and managed to croak out, I don't know. He pinched his lips into a tight frown and stared at me as though searching my face for what to say. Then, before I understood what was happening, he wrapped his arms around me in a tight hug, bending down to reach my 4.5-foot frame, average for most meadow elves, tiny to his looming stature. I didn't move at first, but after a moment, I wrapped my arms around him gently and sighed. It had been over a year since a man other than my father had hugged me. It was strange, but nice. And for a moment, I let everything be all right for once. Everything was okay, and it felt like he was there to make it that way.